In the early parts of the 1800s, Texas had a small Mexican population, less than 5,000 citizens, throughout the entire vast territory. The Mexican government, having finally thrown off the colonial rule by the Spanish Empire in 1821, was having a hard time in this frontier area defending itself from the indigenous population. So, as a way to help bolster their numbers and defend against those folks, the Mexican government opened up immigration to the Anglos. The prospect of cheap land drew many settlers, as did the ability to flee crimes and debts owed in the United States. Their numbers swelled quickly. By the 1830s, Tejanos, or Mexican Texans, numbered 7,500, but Anglos numbered over 30,000. With an additional 5,000 enslaved African Americans the Anglos had brought with them. But they weren't sending their best. They were sending folks who assaulted and threatened a judge, smuggled slaves into the United States illegally to sell, stole unmarked cattle, and were fugitives of the law. See, the Mexican government was being flooded by an invasion, if you would, these Anglos from the United States. The settlers were predominantly from the American South, and brought with them their racial prejudice. Additionally, while Mexicans were predominantly Roman Catholic, these new settlers were mostly Protestants. In 1829, Vicente Guerrero became the second president of the Mexican Republic. There is a dispute of his ethnic background, but there are reports that he was dark-skinned. Whether due to indigenous or African heritage, it is unclear. On September 15, 1829, President Guerrero abolished slavery in Mexico. This act, much like the election of Lincoln in 1860 for the United States, started the rumblings of civil war throughout Mexico. Antonio López de Santa Anna led a revolt to overthrow the Mexican government. He was known to shift sides depending upon political practicality. His allegiances were more about him gaining power than any specific ideology. So when he took power after the revolution, slavery was still abolished, and universal male suffrage was established in Mexico, decades prior to either of those things being established in the United States. It is against these reforms the Anglos fought, over 200 of which decided to set up shop in the mission outside of San Antonio, called Mission San Antonio de Valero, which was also known for its nearby cottonwood trees, which in Spanish are called Alamo. You see, I grew up in Texas. We learned this story early. 13 days of glory as a small number of brave Texas fighters valiantly repelled the vast Mexican army. A handful of men versus thousands. The line in the sand, Davy Crockett, a battle that showed the fight and resilience of Texan culture, killed to the last man when refusing to surrender. But what was it really? The numbers are all over the place. The Mexican army numbered either 2,000 or 2,100. Texan troops anywhere from 185 to 260. According to battle reports from the Mexican government, they lost about 60 troops, with 250 wounded. According to the Texans, they killed 600 Mexican troops. To the Mexican military, this was a minor, annoying victory with minimal losses that had little effect on the overall war. To the Texan military, this was a turning point. The war cry of "Remember the Alamo!" rang out as they charged at the Battle of San Jacinto. There's a report from a man named Ben, a former slave turned cook for the Mexican army, that stated Davy Crockett was found with 16 Mexican corpses around him. However, other Mexican accounts of Crockett state he surrendered and was executed after the battle. Nearly every detail of this battle has been disputed in one way or the other. Yet, when we look at fantasy world building, we know for a fact that 2,000 City Watch were accompanied by 100 Lannister soldiers that fought in the Battle of Blackwater Bay against 10,000 Baratheon troops sailing on 200 ships that included 30 Lysine mercenary vessels. As Yoda would say, "So certain are you?" I don't think fantasy world builders or the general public really understand how history works, but it shapes our culture, views, and even our political beliefs. I feel like it's something we should understand. Hello folks, I'm Legal Kimchi. And if you like what I'm doing here, please be sure to hit that subscribe button, like the video, and share it around. It really helps the channel. You can also support me on Patreon at patreon.com/legalkimchi. And for the first time, you can also help yourself by improving your games and checking out today's sponsor, Domil's Wondrous Works. Yeah, that's right. I have a sponsor. And if you clicked on this video, it's probably something that's right up your alley. Domil's Wondrous Works digitally hand paints immersive atmospheric maps with a lot of verticality. The dynamic battle space with choke points, line of sight obstructions, and cover spots keep your tabletop combat engaging and exciting. They offer static and phased maps. Phased maps are maps that evolve with the encounter, keeping your players on their toes. Like this one. Imagine having an encounter on a ship that is slowly sinking, creating a dynamic environmental challenge to the encounter. Or one where a giant kraken slowly emerges like a fantasy time bomb, adding urgency to a puzzle or encounter. You can get them at shops.dwwmaps.com, or you can support them on Patreon for map packs, discounts on map purchases, and monthly maps. You can see the link down in the description below. Now, back to the video. Chapter 1. How the past is created in the present. I am not a historian. I am a history enthusiast. YouTube is full of history enthusiasts, and the very nature of the platform incentivizes outrageous claims and a level of certainty that no reasonable professional should have. Now, previously I have poked fun at SwordTube, or whatever folks call them, for being a little too full of themselves and a little too lacking in sources to actually be trusted. Many of them are stuck in their ethnocentricities, their skewed views of what is or is not history, and the unearned confidence of someone who doesn't know enough to know that they actually don't know. I've made a video about not trusting all sources without question before. Look, there's no need to rehash that ground. But there is something about history that I think makes it more interesting as a subject to study than this boring rote memorization of dates, facts, and figures. History is more poetry than statistics, more narrative than timeline. Eminent U.S. historian Charles Beard was a major thought leader. Dear God, I've been working in corporate America too long. He was renowned in his field and one of the major voices of progressive historiography. This group was dominant in the early 20th century in U.S. academic circles in the subject of history. The basics are that they would tackle an economic interpretation of history, viewing history in the lens of economics. I could go into the nature of the way he viewed researching history, but I'd rather discuss the nature of how he viewed history. Quote,
"Every written history of a village, town, county, state, nation, race, group, class, idea, or the wide world is a selection and arrangement of facts, of recorded fragments of past actuality. And the selection and arrangement of facts, a combined and complex intellectual operation, is an act of choice, conviction, and interpretation respecting values, is an act of thought. Facts, multitudinous beyond calculation, are known, but they do not select themselves, or force themselves automatically into any fixed scheme of arrangement in the mind of a historian. They are selected and ordered by him as he thinks." From historian Charles Beard.
We seem to forget that humans are the instruments from which histories are written. As such, our biases, our feelings, our values are imprinted on the things that we discuss. Think of it this way. Let's say your day is over. You're sitting down with your pen and paper to write in your diary. You recount the facts of your day. Maybe you discuss the lunch that you had with a friend, a project at work that you finally got done, or a coffee date with that new guy you met online. Think about all the details that you would put into your diary entry. Now, try to imagine how someone else would recount the facts of your day. Maybe they don't care about your work project. Maybe they describe your outfit. Maybe they describe in detail the routine that you do every day. Maybe they talk about how the air smelled sweet after last night's rain, or how you had that one song stuck in your head all day. What you decide to write about can say more about you than the actual facts of your day. There is a choice in that chronicle. This is true with how you use your words. Online, I see a lot of argument back and forth with regards to the actions taken by the Israeli government in Gaza. Some, including myself, refer to it as a genocide. Others don't like using that word. There are many different accounts of the numbers of the dead, but regardless of the figure, there is a massive death toll. And I am of two minds when thinking about this. On one hand, my legal brain emphasizes the importance of the words we use. The definitions have bearing on the criminality of certain actions. On the other hand, there's a part of me that wonders if there is a substantive difference between mass murder, or death, and genocide. It all means catastrophe. The words you use don't change the death, the destruction, the hate that permeates this mess. The argument of semantics matters little to the dead and suffering. And how will history discuss his event? And who will write those histories? How will their interpretations of ostensibly the same event differ between them? Which numbers will they use? These are the questions that we don't seem to ask when we read the books that inform us of the history of events. I know what some of you are thinking. You may be writing this in the comments right now. Sure, some writers may color the story with their biases, but history is a set of immutable facts. That's how it works. But is it how it works?
That would be no.
No?
No.
It's sifting through evidence, finding sources, but understanding the nature of those sources. I've already discussed the issue with primary sources with the discussion of the person recounting their day. The same can be said for documents. What information is available in documents we recover tells us about what was important to the people who wrote those documents. And that's just talking about primary source material. Secondary sources are also things you can't take on face value. For instance, in the West, the first historian is widely considered to be Herodotus, the person who is allegedly the one to investigate historical events when trying to come up with the real story of what happened. This is the person who is credited with actually thinking about history in the way that we do now. In his landmark work, simply called Histories, there contain passages like this.
Here in this desert, there live among the sand great ants, in size somewhat less than dogs, but bigger than foxes. The Persian king has a number of them, which have been caught by the hunters in the land whereof we are speaking. Those ants make their dwelling underground, and much like the Greek ants, which they very much resemble in shape, throw up sand heaps as they burrow. Now the sand which they throw up is full of gold. The Indians, when they go into the desert to collect this sand, take 3 camels and harness them together, a female in the middle and a male on either side, in a leading rein. Is Herodotus describing a dream that he had?
So, these giant ants that dig up gold. Did Herodotus see this happening? Was this a misunderstanding? Was he talking about marmots or some other rodents? Was someone mistaken about the gold in the sand? You see these questions we're asking? That's the issue that plagues historians. Do you take it on face value, or do you try to interpret what they mean? And this is actually one of the more explainable passages of weirdness in the histories. The interpretation of history isn't that different from the interpretation of something like the Bible in religious studies. Various religious groups range from seeing the Bible as being the literal word of God, and others who state that the entire text is interpretive and nothing in there is to be taken as real. And that's only within the group of people who consider themselves Christian believers. Of course, there is also the whole issue of how history can change. Chapter 3. No need for time travel. A little over 500 years ago, some ships found an island. They were trying to get to a trading port to engage in the normal trade with a foreign country. However, on their way, they found land that they were not expecting to see. It was a rather inauspicious event. When the ships returned, no one back home really cared. In fact, they were a little upset that they didn't make it to where they were supposed to go. There was an explorer that led this expedition. He sailed with 3 Spanish ships, La Santa Maria de la Inmaculada Concepcion, La Santa Clara, and a 3rd ship, whose name has been lost to time. This explorer was granted permission to head back over to Asia to colonize any lands that he could find. On his 2nd voyage, he took 17 ships. He set up his colonies, warred with the local people, established a brutal system of slavery. His brutality was actually so severe, he was placed in chains, and along with his brothers, languished in jail for 6 years. His claim to fame was the first long-term conquest of lands during his invasion of North America. And for some reason, we have a day that we celebrate with his name on it. Columbus Day was not a holiday in the United States until 1934, and it was due to a myriad of different things converging at once. It was the rise of the Italian-American population, who looked at Columbus as a symbol of the Italians coming to North America, and seen as a day to celebrate Italian culture. Also, oddly, it was helped with the rise of the Irish population in the United States. See, the Italians and the Irish population were not always welcome in the U.S. They were the targets of early anti-immigrant groups in this country's early history. 11 Italian Americans were lynched by a mob in New Orleans in 1891. As a response, the first National Columbus Day was celebrated. In a sort of proto-intersectional view of the situation, the Italians and the Irish had something in common. They were both Catholic. In 1882, Father Michael McGivney founded the Fraternal Mutual Benefit Society for Immigrant Catholics in the United States. These folks would provide mutual aid, promote the rights of immigrant Catholics, and provide community to these groups along those religious lines. Early Italian and Irish Catholics were denied access to things like labor unions and social services when they arrived to this country. Their poor were abandoned, and he was going to organize this group to help those in need. Admirable goals. And to name this organization, he chose the moniker the Knights of Columbus, both hearkening back to the religious order of knights in the Middle Ages and Columbus's name, to signify it as an organization of North America. Well, this group, along with the groups organizing Italian and Irish immigrant populations together, promoted Columbus Day as a day to celebrate their communities. So, with a push from the Knights of Columbus and Italian-American groups, Congress established Columbus Day as an official national holiday in 1934. 8 years later, during the Second World War, 1,500 Italian Americans were sent to internment camps by the FBI. So we have this holiday. Not because Columbus was a great person. He was just a name of convenience that a group of immigrants rallied around as a symbol. I remember a Bugs Bunny cartoon that I saw when I was a kid. It was originally released back in like 1951 called Here We Go, and it shows this.
Round, lad, round, lad, round, lad, round. Columbo, the world she's flat. The world she's around. She's flat. Look, King, she's around like the apple. She's flat like the pancake.
His story and the history changed over the course of 500 years. First, he set sail to India, got lost, then established a colony for Spain. Later, he became a hero who discovered the Americas, proved that the earth was round, and became a symbol of Italian and Irish American communities. Then, he became a genocidal invader whose brutality shocked the world. His was a case of manufactured importance. At best, he was lucky. Set off in the other direction and fumbled onto a continent that Europeans didn't know was there. And the people of the Americas had lived there for millennia and established their own civilizations. And Leif Erikson, not Leif Garrett. There we go. This European stumbled into North America first, almost 500 years before Columbus. All of this import, his whole story, was created. Now, the opposite of manufactured importance is manufactured silence. Henri Christophe was born a slave. fought as a revolutionary, then crowned as a king. Much of his youth is in dispute, and has been since his death. Legends grow around a person with such a meteoric rise. I mean, how could they not? Now, there's a lot of history within the story of the Haitian Revolution. Honestly, any summary of this momentous event is going to do a disservice. Suffice to say, when Henri Christophe came to power, even among the Haitian revolutionaries, he had enemies. As is often the case after a revolution succeeds, interpersonal fighting, power grabs, and old rivalries re-emerge. One such rival was Jean-Baptiste Sans Souci. During the long and intense conflict for independence, Henri Christophe went from rebel leader to French commander. This happened with a lot of the Haitian revolutionaries. But one of the commanders that never switched sides was Sans Souci. Jean-Baptiste Sans Souci never forgot the times that he had to lead troops in battle for Haiti, but against Christophe. So when Christophe became the leader of the Republic of Haiti, Sans Souci resented it. He didn't like taking orders from a former enemy. However, for the sake of this new nation, Sans Souci agreed to meet with Christophe to resolve their differences. When he arrived to the meeting, Sans Souci was assassinated by Christophe's men. Afterwards, Henri Christophe had a palace built, and as a way of changing the meaning of the word in the Haitian lexicon, he named the palace Sans Souci. When early European historians wrote about this palace, they took the bait. Clearly, they said, this building was based on Frederick the Great's Prussian palace in Potsdam named Sans Souci, French for carefree. Look at the hints of European architecture. Clearly, this was the reason for the name. Haitian historians, however, disagree. Much of the idea of this video came from reading this book, Silencing the Past, by Michel-Rolph Trouillot. The intent here was to associate the name Sans Souci with the palace to erase from the histories the contributions of Jean-Baptiste Sans Souci. European historians put what they thought the inspiration was because that's what they assumed it would be. Clearly, this Haitian leader was just taking his inspiration from European histories. Surely that was the source of the name. The idea that it was from something else didn't even occur to them. That was their bias showing. This is something that plagues the histories of LGBTQ folks as well. The language behind so much of our modern understanding of these topics is so new, accounts of these people in history are spotty at best and leave room for a lot of interpretation. In 1866, Cathay Williams signed up for the U.S. Army. A former slave, they served under the name William Cathay. See, the Army had a prohibition against women fighting in the infantry. Now, Cathay Williams served for 2 years. It's unclear if Cathay Williams was transgender. It would not have been prudent for them to present themselves as such at that time, or now, given the nature of how this country's going. It can be interpreted that they were, or they might not have been, and just wanted to serve in the military. This is a case where there really isn't enough documentation to be sure, which is true of a lot of history, which is why it's so easy for manipulation to occur. It makes me think of the classic hot coffee case. I may have discussed this before. Most folks have heard of the case of the woman who sued McDonald's because their coffee was too hot. This comes up usually to ridicule the lady for being so ignorant as to not know that coffee is hot. Ridiculous. Except that's not the whole story. See, when you drink coffee, it's around 140 degrees Fahrenheit, or about 60 degrees Celsius. McDonald's was storing their coffee at closer to 180 to 190 degrees Fahrenheit, or around 82 to 88 degrees Celsius. McDonald's stated that the reason for the higher temperature was that they didn't intend people to drink coffee until they got to their destination, back at home or at work. So the coffee would cool during the drive. Since they held their coffee at this higher temperature, this 79-year-old woman suffered third-degree burns on her legs and sensitive areas, requiring 8 days in the hospital, including multiple skin grafts. During the legal fight, she was just trying to get McDonald's to help with the medical bills. But McDonald's pushed a narrative, and the media outlets ate it up. I learned about this case a second time during law school. A powerful show of corporate and political agenda being pushed to protect the business from a legitimate case. But that is the way of history. It's more than just history is written by the winners. History is written with an agenda. And in the real world, that has real-world consequences. In created worlds, this can actually be a wonderful tool to capture your audience or your players. Chapter 2. So, question everything? Wait, isn't the previous chapter the second chapter? But it was called the third chapter. So, are we going to refer to it as the second chapter, or by its name, which is chapter 3? What about this? Is this now chapter 3, or is this like an interlude? And the next chapter, which is... Well, according to the timestamps, it's also called chapter 3. Is that the real chapter 3? How will history record the chapters in this video essay? Do you see what I mean? Chapter 3. For real this time. Or is it? I am no scientist, but after getting really curious about something, I'll look it up and I'll ask some friends. Some of those friends are mathematicians and, well, scientists. So I wanted to know the difference between a scientific theory and a scientific law. Why is something that we all take as true still considered a theory? And they explained it to me thusly. A theory is something where there is an answer that we test over and over again, and the math still works, and the experiment does what we thought it would. It's something we can be pretty certain of because it's been exhaustively tested. If that's true, what's a law? I know it's ironic for me to ask that question, right? A law is like a math statement that tells us why something happens. Now, were those both massive oversimplifications? Yes, because my legal brain is good at a lot of things, but understanding in-depth science and mathematics, not one of them. So there will be a comment below that may or may not explain it better. That's fine. You do you. Go nuts. A theory in science is not the same as a guess. It is something that is backed up by a lot of tests and evidence, like germ theory. Germ theory tells us that germs cause diseases. So things like washing your hands, wearing masks, and making sure you don't touch your eyes or mouth help with limiting the transmission of diseases by stopping the spread of germs. I know what you're thinking. Why the hell is this dude talking about germs in science? I'm getting to that. Well, those analytical viewers may already be thinking about problematic issues that come up when we view all history as interpretation. Don't worry, I don't mean you. You keep folding your laundry, and I know you're just listening to me in the background. Oh, and by the way, your soup is boiling already, so you may want to cut the stove. You don't want to overcook that. Anyway, the issue would be folks trying to reimagine history and push an agenda that the evidence doesn't really support. Holocaust deniers or lost cause folks come to mind. But if all history is interpretive, then how do we know that 6 million Jews died in the Holocaust, or that the Confederate States rebelled against the United States due to slavery or states' rights? Well, overwhelming evidence. See, with regards to the lost cause idea, time and time again, the Confederate States of America stated in their own official documents why they seceded. Specifically, the Confederate Ordinance of Secession and the individual Articles of Secession by the states of Georgia, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Texas all mentioned that it was due to them wanting to keep their slaves. I mean, I could go on because there is overwhelming evidence, but feel free to look at the many videos by Atun Shei Films on Checkmate Lincolnites, or read any of the documents of the seceding states to learn this. They were not shy about it. They said it a lot. As for the Holocaust, well, that number comes from many different sources, including government officials of the German government during World War II. Adolf Eichmann was quoted by a fellow German official in court stating that their estimation was that they killed about 6 million Jews in either the camps, shootings, or other methods of murder by 1944. Raoul Hilberg, an Austrian-American historian and political scientist, wrote a mammoth book, The Destruction of the European Jews, which was the first major work to chronicle the Jewish genocide in Germany. Coming in at almost 1,400 pages and compiling information from German government documents and other primary sources across Europe, he came up with a figure of around 5.1 million people. His work was criticized by Jewish historian Yad Vashem, who also did a count of just the names of those he could find that were confirmed to have died by German hands. And his count got over 4 million confirmed names in his limited database. Lucy Davidovitz reviewed birth and death records to come up with a precise number of 5,933,900 killed. Wolfgang Benz, a German historian, estimated around 5.3 to 6.2 million. So we have various historians working off of different and overlapping data who didn't even like each other personally, who came up with figures in the same ballpark. Even finding flaws in the methodology of any of these individually would not explain the relative consistency of that number. And regardless of if you take the lower or higher estimate, the number is staggering. I would even argue the exact figure is kind of meaningless. The number is enormous, the evil unfathomable. Even if they're off by 1 or 2 million, does it really matter? Does it change the reality of a population so devastated or the scale of the atrocity? This feels like the idea of beyond a reasonable doubt in law. The avalanche of evidence can tell us certain things that happened. So while I always advise you to question what you read, if you confirm a mountain of evidence, skepticism can turn from healthy to ridiculous very quickly. I mean, say what you will about germ theory, but I wouldn't want people to cough in my mouth anytime soon. Would you? Chapter 4. Oh yeah, his channel's about tabletop role-playing games. Continuity is overrated. I love world building. I do it constantly. It's part of the reason I love being a game master. Probably has something to do with my love of imagining myself as a god. I'll try not to overthink that. And game masters generally love those note-taker players. I have one of them in my group, and if not for their diligent work, I swear the party would lose half the treasure to memory at this point. The issues that may come up from these wonderful players, however, is that they detect inconsistencies. Here, inconsistency can actually be turned into something more realistic, because when talking about history, it's more plausible. There's an old phrase: there are 3 sides to any story: your side, their side, and the truth. The problem that most folks have is believing that the truth is something that could be found. The best we can do is to try our best to get as close as possible. This isn't for you to start saying that nothing is real and historical events didn't happen. As we discussed previously, there could be a lot of evidence pointing one way or the other. Rather, when you hear about someone talking about another look at history, it isn't always with a political agenda. It is sometimes looking back at the context of what happened.
I don't know what's wrong with you young people. You think you just fell out of a coconut tree? You exist in the context of all in which you live and what came before you.
But here's the thing that makes it a good tool for game masters. Let's say you're running a political game. A game that has various factions vying for power or the advantage of some kind or another, warring houses or rival guilds, doesn't really matter. They have different reasons for fighting and will view the exact same event through different lenses. One thing that I like to do is to look at those websites that tell you political biases in the news outlets so you can understand the different points of view of the people who are writing the articles. I love looking at the exact same news story and seeing how 2 different media companies with their different points of view will report on the same story. Now, practice that spin. Consider a dispute between the Mages Guild and a shipping guild. They fight over the use of teleportation versus transporting goods via ships. You could imagine folks discussing this in various parts of the same town as follows. Consider these headlines. Mages Guild makes your things disappear, along with the coins in your purse, and the mystery of where those things go. Or maybe, the shipping guild will take 3 weeks to transport your wares, but 3 seconds to take your gold. Who gets the goods? Your partner, the pirates, or the pale blue sea? And a neutral headline? The mages and shipping guilds are opening shops in Waterdeep. I love thinking about how different groups view the same event. If you know anything about me and my Korean heritage, you know that I have no love lost for Imperial Japan during the beginning of the 20th century. They were ruthless in conquering the lands around them, but in their own minds, they saw themselves as trying to act like and be as strong as the Western powers that dominated most of the global trade and diplomacy. They emerged from a history of isolation, where they were forced to interact with the outside world by a Western power. Their society went through 260 years of progression within 20 years of real time. They wanted power, relevance, and riches, so they conquered their neighbors. What they did was just as terrible as what Western powers did when they conquered and colonized. It doesn't excuse the behavior, but it puts it in the proper context. Of course, they viewed the US as a Western colonizing force, and US propaganda dehumanized the Japanese. It went both ways. So it should be with your kingdoms, your governments, your organizations, and guilds in your world. If the Elven Kingdom and the Orc Kingdom don't like each other, is that because the Orcs are evil, or because they've just had back and forth skirmishes and no one really remembers who struck first? Maybe it was the elves who thoughtlessly started the conflict. Maybe it was the orcs who started it and their government is aggressive expansionists. Side note, while I don't really like inherently evil orcs in my game, as I've discussed before, that doesn't mean that orc kingdoms can't be bad. Maybe the orc ruler is a fascist or something. It can happen. The exercise of trying to put yourself in the shoes of the other side, even when it's in your own created world, may give you some insight to how different people think. It also just might have your players not automatically know which side to take, and that gives them a delicious choice in the game. Conclusion. Does this count as a chapter 2? There's a story I tell about a friend of mine that passed away a few years ago. It involves a conversation we had almost 20 years ago. It's something that affected me in an important way. It was a point of inspiration, a mantra that I used in my adult life. But if I'm being honest with myself, I can't say with 100% certainty if my friend actually said those words. It's weird to realize that. I can't even confirm the details with the other person who was a part of this conversation because they're not around to ask anymore. And you probably can think of many instances of something similar, misremembering a detail, big or small. History is like that. Recollections from documents, personal accounts, interviews, evidence gathered from many sources, sometimes with an agenda, sometimes to form a narrative. As Churchill said, history is written by the victors. Except he didn't say that. What he said was, for my part, I consider that it will be found much better by all parties to leave the past to history, especially as I propose to write that history myself. In fact, the earliest written example that's close to that comes from an 1889 account of the Battle of Culloden, which itself took place in 1746, which stated, "It is the victor who writes the histories and counts the dead." So, the fact about Churchill saying this iconic phrase isn't true. And that's what comforts me when I think of my friend. What she said exactly doesn't matter as much as the message behind it and the effect that it had on me. And maybe that's true of history as well. The exact number of troops or casualties doesn't matter as much. Maybe whether fire arrows were used in medieval combat, or what Paul Revere said on his midnight ride, isn't the point. History affects us, moves us, inspires us, stands as a warning, and teaches us about the present and the future. It is a story, one we all shape in the telling. Thanks for watching.
I'd like to give a shout out to all of my patrons, most especially Les Howie, Caleb Lackey, and Sidekick. I gotta be honest, folks, the Patreon support has been so valuable in helping me get these videos out, and just personally, I really appreciate it. And if you would like to support the channel and get your name in these videos, please support the Patreon at patreon.com/legalkimchi. Thank you.